"If that dog bites me, I swear I'm suing the whole shelter," I said out loud, mostly to myself, as I stood frozen in front of Kennel 19. I hadn't meant for it to come out like that, but the woman walking by with a mop stopped and looked me over, one eyebrow raised. "He won't bite," she said. "He's just different." Different? The word hung in the air like a challenge. I'd volunteered at enough shelters over the years to know what different meant. It meant the dog had been here too long. Meant the staff had run out of euphemisms. Meant nobody wanted him, and nobody could figure out how to fix that. The dog sat still behind the chain-link door, not barking, not moving, just watching. His fur was a wild tangle of grays and tans, long around the ears and patchy along the sides. He looked like someone had tried to make a mop into a wolf and quit halfway through. One eye was cloudy, the other sparkled, bright and yellow. There was something in that eye. Not fear, not anger, something else. Curiosity, maybe. I stepped closer. He didn't growl, didn't cower, just watched me. "What's his name?" I asked. The woman shrugged. "Tag just says Reggie. He came in with it. No chip, no records, nothing." Reggie. Didn't suit him at all. But I wasn't here to rename dogs. I was here because I'd told my brother I was ready to adopt again. It had been 2 years since I lost Rusty, my golden retriever, and honestly, I hadn't thought I'd ever be able to fill that hole again. But things change. People heal. At least that's what everyone kept saying. I crouched and peered through the cage bars. "Hey, Reggie," I said softly. Still nothing. Not even a tail wag. "I'll give you a minute," the staffer said, and walked off with her mop. I stayed there, crouched like a fool, trying to get a feel for this strange, silent creature. He blinked slowly. His head tilted, just an inch. And then I saw it. The tag on his collar. It wasn't a standard ID tag. It was worn brass, round like a coin. I squinted. Something was written on it. I leaned in closer. "Read it," the woman's voice called from down the hallway. "It's the only reason we haven't put him down yet." Put him down. The words punched me in the chest. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it through the bars. The tag read, "If you're reading this, I was loved once." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "Come on, Reggie," I said. "Let's get you out of here." He didn't move. The staffer returned with a set of keys. "You sure about this one?" "Yeah," I said, not taking my eyes off him. "He's the one." She opened the kennel door slowly. Reggie didn't lunge, didn't bolt. He stood, joints creaking, and walked out like an old man who knew there was no hurry. The hallway was silent. Even the other dogs, who'd been barking seconds before, were quiet now. He stood beside me. Just stood, like he was waiting. I reached down. My hand hovered above his matted head for a second, and then I rested it gently on top. He didn't flinch. I felt the softest tail wag against my ankle. Outside, the sun was too bright, the kind of winter sun that makes everything look sharper, cleaner. I opened the passenger door of my truck. "Up you go." He looked at the seat, then at me. "You're not heavy," I said, "and I've lifted heavier." He stepped up like he'd done it 100 times before, settled into the seat, curled up tight. We drove home in silence, except for the soft sound of his breathing. At the house, he took one slow tour of the living room, sniffed each corner, then stood in front of Rusty's old bed. "You can have it," I said. "I kept it clean." He circled once, twice, then lay down with a sigh that sounded like it carried years. I sat on the couch, unsure what came next. The room felt different, warmer. That night he didn't bark, didn't whine, just slept. The next morning, I made eggs. He didn't beg, just sat by the kitchen door and waited. "You're polite. I'll give you that," I said. His ears twitched. Days passed, each one a little less quiet. He started following me from room to room, sat by the bathroom door, waited outside the garage, walked beside me on the leash without tugging. I gave him a proper bath one morning. The fur underneath was a rich golden brown, streaked with white. He looked 10 pounds lighter. "Still not a Reggie," I muttered. I took him to the vet. She ran her hands over him, checked his joints, his teeth, said he was old, maybe 10, maybe more. "He's been through something," she said, "but he's healthy. As healthy as any senior mutt could be." Senior. I started buying him soft chews and joint supplements, watched as his steps grew quicker, his eyes brighter. But he still didn't bark. Not once. One night, I dug through a box of Rusty's old things. Photos, mostly. And a few notes, cards from neighbors. I found a worn-out tennis ball and rolled it across the floor. Reggie watched it go. Then he looked at me, walked over, and nudged it back. It was the first time I laughed out loud in weeks. He wagged his tail and did it again. A week later, we visited the park. I took a seat on the bench, Reggie by my side. A young couple walked past with a toddler holding an ice cream cone. The kid stumbled, dropped the cone, and started to cry. Reggie stood up, walked over, sat in front of the child, and licked the ice cream off the grass. The kid stopped crying. The mom smiled. "He's got good manners," she said. I nodded. "He's got a good heart." That night, I reached for his tag again. "If you're reading this, I was loved once." "You still are," I whispered. He rested his head on my foot. I didn't move for a long time. The next morning, I called the shelter, told them I wanted to cover the adoption fee for the next 3 senior dogs. "Because of Reggie?" the staffer asked. "Because someone loved him enough to leave that message. And now it's my turn." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We just got a 12-year-old beagle in. No tag, no name. Think someone like you will come for him too?" "I hope so," I said. "I really hope so." That night, as I sat on the porch, Reggie by my side, I looked up at the stars. He was snoring gently, one paw twitching in his sleep. I reached down, ran a hand through his fur, and felt that old brass tag. Loved once, now loved again. And that was just the beginning. Reggie barked. Not a big bark, not even a real one, more like a muffled woof that surprised even him. He looked at me afterward like he'd accidentally knocked something off a table and wasn't sure if he was in trouble. "You've got a voice," I said, setting down my coffee. His ears twitched. "Took you long enough." It had been just over a month since I brought him home. The silence that once hung around him like a heavy coat had started to loosen. He made noises now, grunts when he lay down, little puffs of breath when he watched squirrels from the porch, and today, his first real attempt at a bark. I scratched under his chin. "You're figuring it out, huh?" He licked my wrist and wandered to the window, paws resting on the sill. The neighborhood was quiet. Snow lined the curbs, the kind that stuck around without melting. I watched as his tail swayed slowly. I hadn't planned to keep his name, but Reggie had stuck. Maybe it wasn't the name I would have chosen, but he seemed to respond to it in his own way. More importantly, he'd started responding to me. We had our routines now. Morning walks to the mailbox, slow strolls around the cul-de-sac in the afternoons, evening couch time. He liked documentaries. Or maybe he just liked the sound of my voice when I muttered commentary at the screen. And once a week, we drove to the park. That's where we were headed now. "Come on, old man," I said, grabbing his leash. He trotted over, a little bounce in his step. I clipped the leash on, and he was already at the door before I finished. The truck ride was quiet, as usual. I talked. He listened. At the park, Reggie walked like he owned it. Not proud, but comfortable. He sniffed every bush like he was checking on tenants, nodded at other dogs like he knew them. Most of them ignored him. A few barked from a distance. One small white poodle mix tried to run up to him, but Reggie gave a short, low growl, not threatening, just enough to say he wasn't interested. "He's got boundaries," I explained to the owner, a man in his 60s with a thick flannel coat. "That's rare," the man replied, smiling. "Most dogs his age get too soft." Reggie led me to the same bench we always stopped at, near the pond where ducks huddled on the frozen surface. He didn't sit yet, just stood, staring at the water. "You used to come here, didn't you?" I asked. He didn't look at me, but his ears flicked once. It was a hunch. Something about how comfortable he seemed, how he walked without hesitation, like he knew exactly where each path led. I watched him, trying to picture him younger. More energy in his legs, fewer scars on his nose. Maybe a little boy beside him. Or a man. Or both. That tag. Someone had loved him, deeply, enough to give him a voice when he had none. I sat down. Reggie finally did too, pressing his side to my leg. We stayed that way until the cold started settling through my jacket. On the drive back, I stopped by the local hardware store, the kind with creaky floors and hand-painted signs. I needed some brackets for the porch steps, but I figured I'd let Reggie have his say about the place. "Stay," I told him, cracking the window a bit. He stayed, didn't bark, didn't whine, just waited. Inside, the clerk recognized me. "You're the guy with the shaggy dog." "That's me." "He's something. My niece volunteers at the shelter. Said you saved his life." I shrugged. He saved mine too, probably. She handed me the brackets and leaned forward. "You should come to the community event Saturday. Seniors are bringing their adopted dogs for a little meetup. It's nothing big, just some folding chairs and coffee." He doesn't really like crowds. Neither do most of the dogs. That's the point. Reggie was sitting taller when I got back to the truck, watching the door. "We've got an invite, buddy. You feel like being social this weekend?" He sneezed. "I'll take that as a maybe." At home, I noticed the silence again. Not the heavy kind, a good one, comfortable, like a pause in a story where the best part is coming next. Friday night, I gave Reggie another bath, brushed him out until he looked more dog and less tumbleweed. His coat had grown softer since the day I found him. The patchy spots were filling in. He still had one cloudy eye, but the other one gleamed with something new. Light, I guess, or trust. "You ready for Saturday?" He licked his paw and ignored me. Saturday morning came with frost on the windows and the sound of salt trucks in the distance. I packed a thermos of coffee and an old blanket for the folding chairs. Reggie climbed into the truck like it was just another day. The event was held at the edge of the park near the rec center. About a dozen people stood around in coats and scarves, holding leashes or tossing tennis balls. Every dog there moved slowly. A few limped. One was in a doggy wheelchair. I spotted the flannel coat from the park. The man waved. "Glad you came." What's his name again? Reggie. The man smiled. Looks better already. We stood together, making small talk. Reggie sat quietly beside me, observing the other dogs. He didn't approach anyone, didn't try to play, but he didn't retreat either. One of the organizers handed me a Polaroid camera. Mind if we take a picture for the board? We're starting a wall of second chances. I looked at Reggie. Smile, old man. He didn't, of course, but he looked at the camera with that curious tilt of his head. They snapped the photo, wrote our names on the bottom, and clipped it to a corkboard under a sign that said, "Found each other." We didn't stay long. Reggie gave me a glance after half an hour that clearly meant, "We're done here." On the way home, we stopped at the corner store. I let him pick a toy from the little rack by the counter. He sniffed a rubber chicken, a plush squirrel, and finally settled on a stuffed star with a smiley face. I wasn't sure why, but he held it in his mouth all the way to the truck. That night, he lay on the rug chewing the star slowly. Not with excitement, more like he was savoring it. I poured myself a drink and sat down beside him. You know, I said, you could have ended up anywhere. And here we are. He paused, looked up at me, and dropped the toy. Then, for the first time, he did something he hadn't done before. He rested his head in my lap. I sat still, not wanting to ruin the moment. We stayed like that until the ice in my glass melted. Sunday morning, I found myself up early. Too early. Reggie was still asleep, curled tightly in Rusty's old bed. I made coffee, then sat with the photo from the event. Our picture, clipped to the fridge now with a magnet shaped like a bone. I wondered who had loved him before. What kind of life he'd had. What kind of people had given him that tag. Maybe it didn't matter. He was here now. Safe. Warm. Wanted. But the thought lingered. Later that day, I made a call. Hi, I said to the shelter director. Do you still have Reggie's intake records? Not much, just what was on the tag. Can I see it? The tag? You have it? I mean, the back. We never looked. I checked. The back was nearly worn smooth, but under the right light I saw it. An address. Faded. Scratched, but legible. Not far. I told Reggie, even though he probably didn't understand. We're going on a road trip tomorrow. He lifted his head. Just to see, nothing more. The next morning we drove west, just 20 miles, through smaller roads and out past the edge of town. The address led to a farmhouse, not run down but not pristine either. Lived in. A man in his 70s stepped onto the porch as we pulled in. He had a cane and a deep furrow between his eyes. Can I help you? I got out slowly. Reggie stayed in the truck. Sorry to bother you, I said. I adopted a dog a while back. Found your address on his old tag. The man's face didn't change. Not at first. He's got one cloudy eye, shaggy coat. Answers to Reggie. The man stepped forward, slowly. You brought him? He's in the truck. The man walked closer. I opened the door. Reggie sat, watching. Then his ears perked. The old man said one word. Tucker? And Reggie whined. Not a sad sound. Not scared. Just recognition. I opened the door wider. Reggie stepped out, walked up to the man, sniffed his shoes, and leaned against his leg. The man dropped his cane. He didn't fall, just knelt, both hands in Reggie's fur. He was my son's. I waited. My boy died 4 years ago. I couldn't take care of Tucker after that. I tried, but I wasn't right. And one day he ran off. I figured he was gone for good. He looked at me. You called him Reggie. I nodded. Doesn't matter, he said. He knows you now. Reggie, or Tucker, looked between us. His tail wagged once. I didn't know what to say, so I said the truth. He saved me, too. We stayed a while. Talked. The man gave me a picture of Tucker and his son. It sat on my dash all the way home. Reggie didn't seem confused, didn't seem torn, just tired. He curled up in his bed that night and slept like he hadn't in weeks. I looked at the old photo, a boy in his 20s, arms around a younger version of Reggie, both smiling. "You were loved," I said softly. He opened one eye and wagged his tail. Reggie had taken to sleeping with one paw stretched out toward the hallway, like he was halfway to getting up, but not quite ready. Every morning I'd find him in the same position, his snore soft and rhythmic, his nose twitching as if chasing rabbits in a dream. The photo of him with the boy, his first owner, still sat on my bookshelf, right next to Rusty's collar. I didn't change his name. I thought about it, thought about calling him Tucker again. But when I said it aloud, he didn't turn his head. When I said Reggie, he looked up. So Reggie, he stayed. Maybe names meant less to dogs than they did to us. Maybe it was the voice behind them that mattered. Tuesday morning, I made oatmeal, then added a spoonful of peanut butter and set it on the floor for him. He licked it once, and then looked at me like, "Really?" "Just trying something new," I said, laughing. He sat beside me as I read the paper. Not out of interest, I assumed, but more because he liked having his head against my foot. The contact had become part of our routine. A quiet way of saying, "I'm here. You're here. We're fine." That afternoon, we took a walk down Mill Street. The snow had finally melted off the sidewalks, and the air had that early hint of spring in it. The kind that tricks you into forgetting winter's not quite done. Reggie trotted ahead on his leash, stopping every few feet to sniff a post or look suspiciously at squirrels. Near the coffee shop, a girl was sitting on the bench, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. She couldn't have been more than 10. Her backpack was open on the ground beside her, notebooks and pencils scattered in the slush. Reggie pulled toward her. "Hey," I said gently, trying to ease him back. But she looked up, and Reggie stopped. He just stood there, tail still, ears slightly forward. The girl stared at him, and then, slowly, reached out her hand. Reggie stepped closer. One paw, then another. She ran her fingers along his head, carefully, like she wasn't sure if he was real. Then she smiled. Just barely. "His name's Reggie," I said. She didn't say anything, just kept petting him. After a few moments, she looked at me. "He's not scared of me." "Not one bit." She looked down. "Most dogs don't like me. I move too fast. That's what my mom says." "Reggie's a slow guy," I said. "He likes quiet. And he's good at sitting still." She smiled again. "I like sitting still too. People don't think I do, but I do." We stood there in silence until a woman came running around the corner, her face pale and worried. "Emily!" she called out. The girl looked up. "I'm here!" The woman rushed over, eyes darting between me and Reggie. "I've been looking everywhere. Are you okay?" Emily nodded. "I was just with the dog." The woman knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "He's friendly," I said. She nodded, glancing at Reggie. "She gets overwhelmed. Sometimes she walks off when she needs space." "I get that," I said. Emily gave Reggie one last scratch behind the ears. "Bye, Reggie." He wagged his tail once. As they walked off, I felt Reggie lean into my leg. "Yeah, I said, scratching the top of his head. "You're a therapy dog, whether you like it or not." That night I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the old chest in the garage. It had been Rusty's box. Leashes, balls, a few drawings from my nephews, and one old yellow raincoat that had never fit any dog quite right. I found his worn-out vest, the one he'd worn when we used to visit the retirement home together, back when I thought volunteering would make me feel useful. Reggie padded in behind me and sat down beside the box. "You ever want a job?" I asked. He sniffed the vest. Didn't chew it, just sat. I found myself looking up the local therapy dog program that night. They had orientations every other month. I filled out the form. Didn't submit it, just saved it as a draft. Reggie lay beside the couch, head on my socked foot, his breathing slow. The next few days passed in their usual rhythm. Morning walks, coffee, afternoon porch sitting. I started noticing how Reggie would pause outside certain houses, always the ones with wind chimes. He'd tilt his head, listening, until the sound faded. Saturday morning, I took him back to the park. We passed the bench by the pond. He sniffed it, circled once, then moved on. This time he didn't stop. He wanted to keep going. I let him lead. We ended up at the small footbridge that crossed the stream at the far end of the trail. It wasn't somewhere I usually went. Too quiet, too far out. Reggie stepped onto the bridge, paused, looked down at the water. Then he barked. Just once. A sharp, clear sound. I stood beside him and looked down. A duck floated below. Just one. Probably late to migrate. Reggie stared at it like it owed him money. I couldn't help but laugh. "You tell him." We sat on the bench just past the bridge, the one with the plaque that read, "For those who waited." Reggie lay at my feet. I sipped coffee. The wind picked up a little, carrying the scent of pine. An older man in a jogging suit passed by, slowed, looked at Reggie. "That your dog?" "Yes, sir." "Looks like someone brought a heart back to life." I nodded. He gave a little wave and kept going. Sunday evening, I heard a knock at the door. A boy stood there, maybe 16. Nervous eyes. He held a brown envelope. "Are you the guy with the dog, Reggie?" "I am. My grandfather said you came by last week. Said you had his son's dog." I nodded. "He wrote this. For you. Said you should have it." He handed me the envelope and walked off before I could say much. Inside was a letter. Handwritten. Careful script. He talked about his son. About how they used to go to that same park. About how Reggie, or Tucker, would wait by the front door every evening at 5, tail wagging, no matter the weather. He wrote, "When I lost my son, I couldn't handle losing the dog, too. I made a mistake. I let him go. You gave him what I couldn't." At the bottom, a simple line. "Thank you for letting an old dog believe again." I folded the letter and placed it in the box with the picture. Reggie nudged my elbow. I scratched his ear. "You ready for bed?" He stretched, yawned, and wandered down the hall. Later that night, I found him not in his bed, but curled up outside my bedroom door. Maybe it was the letter, or the memory, or just the way the wind moved through the trees. But I felt something shift. Not closure. Not quite. But peace. And in the morning, I opened that saved email draft. I hit submit. Reggie's second act was about to begin. The wind was still carrying winter's breath when Reggie and I showed up for the first therapy dog orientation. The community center was tucked between a post office and an insurance agency. in a part of town that felt too quiet for a Saturday. Reggie stepped out of the truck with more confidence than I expected, his nose already working overtime as we approached the building. Inside, the warmth hit us like a thick blanket. Folding chairs lined the walls, a coffee urn hissed in the corner, and half a dozen dogs lay at their owner's feet, each one older than the next. Reggie walked through like he was visiting old friends, pausing briefly to sniff an elderly pug who gave him a half-hearted tail wag. A woman with silver hair and bright red glasses greeted us with a clipboard. "You must be Reggie." I smiled. "I guess I'm just the chauffeur." She grinned and handed me the form. "We'll keep it informal today. We just want to see how he interacts, how he handles stimulation. You'll do great." Reggie sat beside me, his posture calm but alert. When someone knocked over a stack of handouts and they scattered across the tile floor, he didn't flinch, just watched them flutter. For the next hour, we worked our way through stations set up around the room. One had a vacuum cleaner running at low volume. Reggie walked past it without even a glance. Another had a child-sized doll seated in a wheelchair, and the volunteers were supposed to simulate conversation and petting. Reggie approached the chair, sat down, and gently rested his chin on the doll's footrest. "He's got a gift," the red glasses woman said. "You didn't train him?" "Nope, he trained me." At the end of the orientation, we were given a pamphlet and a list of local places open to visits: nursing homes, libraries, support groups. I thanked the staff and led Reggie back to the truck. "Guess you're officially semi-retired," I said. "Time to give back, huh?" He barked once. Not loud, but clear. Our first visit was scheduled for the following Thursday. I chose the library. It was a reading program for children with anxiety or speech delays. The idea was simple. Kids would read aloud to therapy dogs without fear of judgment. Reggie had never been around groups of children before, not since Emily on the bench. But I figured if that moment meant anything, he'd handle it just fine. That morning I brushed him until his coat shone, gave him a bath the night before. He hated it, but endured. I attached the soft blue vest they gave us, labeled with white letters, "Therapy Dog in Training." At the library, we were directed to a colorful corner with bean bags and shelves filled with dog-themed picture books. A boy named Caleb was the first to sit across from us, his book trembling slightly in his hands. Reggie lay down with his head resting near the boy's shoes, tail flicking every now and then. Caleb glanced at him, then at the book. "Hi," he said quietly. Reggie blinked. The boy read slowly, stumbling on certain words. I stayed silent. Reggie didn't move. By the end of the session, Caleb had read 5 full pages without a single correction. He smiled as he closed the book. "I think he listened," Caleb said. "I know he did," I said. Each week after that, we returned. Different kids, different books, but always the same quiet presence from Reggie. He didn't do tricks, didn't even wag much. He just stayed, steady, unmoving, kind. Word started spreading. One day, a newspaper photographer showed up and asked if he could take a picture for a feature on local volunteers. I said sure, as long as the flash stayed off. The next morning, Reggie's face was on the front page of the local section with the headline, "Old Dog New Tricks: How One Senior Pup is Changing Lives." The mailman laughed when he handed me the paper. "Your mutt's famous now." I framed the clipping. Reggie sniffed it once, unimpressed. We added a nursing home to our weekly rotation. On Wednesdays, we visited Maple Pines Senior Living. Reggie would walk through the common area like a mayor, accepting pets and quiet greetings. But there was one resident he always stopped for. A man named George, who sat near the window and never spoke. Reggie would sit beside him, lean against his leg, and stay there the entire visit. No movement, no noise. One day, I overheard a nurse whispering, "He hasn't let anyone sit near him in months." The next week, George said one word when we left. "Thanks." I didn't know if he meant it for me or Reggie, but either way, it stuck. Reggie had become a thread in the fabric of the town. People knew him. Kids waved from school buses. Clerks at the store asked about him. The woman who ran the bakery left out a small paper bag labeled Reggie's Biscuits every Friday. Homemade dog treats with oats and pumpkin. At home, he was still the same quiet presence. He'd sit with me on the porch, watching clouds shift across the sky, ears twitching with each passing breeze. He liked the sound of guitar, I discovered one evening when I dusted off the old one in my closet. He'd lie near the amp, listening as I fumbled through chords I hadn't played in years. One Sunday, my brother stopped by with his boys. They were loud, full of energy, tossing a foam football in the yard. "Will Reggie be okay?" he asked. "Let's see." The boys ran circles around the house. Reggie stood in the middle of the yard, watching. When the youngest tripped and scraped his knee, Reggie was the first one beside him, nose nudging the boy's arm, staying close until the tears stopped. "Your dog's got a heart," my brother said. "Yeah," I said. "He borrowed it from someone. Now he's sharing it." That night, Reggie slept at the foot of my bed. First time he'd ever done that. He stayed until dawn. We visited the shelter again the next week, this time not as adopters, but as volunteers. I'd agreed to help with a program that paired senior citizens with older dogs. Reggie walked through the kennels beside me, occasionally stopping to sniff or wag gently at a nervous mutt behind the fence. He paused at one kennel with a golden Labrador, her eyes cloudy but kind. "Her name's Mags," the volunteer said. "No one's looked at her in 2 months." Reggie sat down in front of her kennel and refused to move. "Someone's trying to make a point," I said. The next week, Mags had a home, with a retired bus driver named Paul, who'd recently lost his wife. Reggie was there the day Paul picked her up. The two dogs touched noses. Mags gave a little wag. In the truck on the way home, I reached over and scratched behind Reggie's ear. "You're matchmaking now?" He gave a content huff. Spring melted fully into summer. The porch grew covered in pollen. Reggie took to lying in the shade beneath the maple tree out back. I mowed the lawn while he supervised. He didn't chase anything. Didn't bark. Just watched, always present. I received a letter in the mail from the library. Inside was a crayon drawing of Reggie next to a stick figure labeled "Me and My Reading Buddy." Signed, Caleb. I stuck it to the fridge next to our picture from the senior meetup. Some evenings, I'd find Reggie staring out the window, his ears alert, but his body still. I'd sit beside him, matching his quiet. Whatever he saw out there, it was his business. I stopped thinking about how long he'd be with me, stopped wondering about the next phase, because every day felt full. Not flashy, not grand, just full. And somehow, that was more than enough. He was a dog rejected by every family until one old brass tag turned everything around. And now, he was turning things around for everyone else. Reggie had a way of making strangers act like neighbors. He didn't do much to earn it. No tricks, no showmanship, not even a bark most days. But he made people pause, look twice, and soften. That's a rare talent in a world that rushes past everything it can't label or sell. It had been nearly 4 months since I found him in Kennel 19, and in that time, our days had slipped into a rhythm that felt permanent in all the best ways. Mornings were slow, coffee for me, soft chews for him. He no longer followed me from room to room like he was afraid I'd disappear. Now he just waited, eyes half closed, tail thumping lazily when he heard me coming. Our therapy visits had become part of our weekly schedule. Mondays at the library, Wednesdays at Maple Pines. We were starting Fridays at the Veterans Center downtown now. New territory. The moment we walked into the lobby that first day, Reggie sat down and looked around like he'd been there before. A man named Hal met us at the door. He had a deep voice and a limp, and wore his fatigue jacket like a second skin. "So you're the famous Reggie," he said, kneeling slower than he probably wanted to. Reggie met him halfway, nose against his knuckles. Hal looked up at me. "He always this calm?" "Pretty much." "Good. Some of the guys in here haven't had calm in a long time." The center smelled like coffee and old leather. A few men sat in recliners, nodding off in front of a muted TV. One guy with a beard down to his chest played solitaire at a corner table. When Reggie approached, he looked up but didn't say anything. Reggie just sat beside him. Quiet. Still. After a few minutes, the man spoke. "You here to listen or judge?" Reggie blinked. "Good," the man said. "Me too." By the time we left, the staff had already asked when we'd come back. I said we'd be there every Friday until someone told us otherwise. Reggie wagged once, as if confirming the contract. Back home, the garden needed tending. We had an unusually wet start to summer, and the grass had turned a shade of green I hadn't seen in years. I spent most of Saturday digging out weeds while Reggie lay in the shade of the shed, watching like an old farmer surveying his land. A neighbor wandered over, a kid named Lucas who'd just finished his freshman year of college. "You mind if I pet him?" "Not at all. Just go slow." Lucas crouched beside Reggie, who lifted his head and gave a lazy sniff. He doesn't even flinch. He doesn't see much point in wasting energy. Lucas laughed. I wish I could be that calm. He stayed a while, talking about finals, and how he wasn't sure what he wanted to major in. Reggie didn't move, but his presence seemed to steady the conversation. Like it was safe to admit you didn't have it all figured out. After Lucas left, I sat on the back steps and looked at Reggie. "You're some kind of magnet," I said. His ears twitched. "You just pull the truth out of people." He gave a soft grunt and stretched out across the warm wood. Sunday morning brought rain, the kind that drummed softly on the roof and made everything smell like earth. Reggie didn't bother getting up until noon. I joined him on the couch with a book I'd started weeks ago. He curled up beside me, snoring before I reached the second chapter. That afternoon, I went through some old boxes in the attic. Not looking for anything, just sorting. That's where I found the album labeled North Ridge Cabin. Pictures from years ago. Me, my brother, our dad, and Rusty, barely out of puppyhood, bounding through snowbanks like he was chasing clouds. There was one photo of him lying in front of the fireplace, tongue out, eyes half closed. I carried the album downstairs and showed it to Reggie. "That was Rusty," I said, tapping the page. Reggie sniffed it, rested his chin on the album. The next morning I made a call. "You think the cabin's still standing?" I asked my brother. "It was the last time we checked. Why?" "Thinking about taking Reggie up there." "You sure? It's a bit of a hike." "He can handle it." I packed light, some canned food, blankets, Reggie's travel bed. The weather forecast was clear, and the road hadn't washed out in years. We left at dawn, the truck humming along back roads that grew narrower with each mile. By noon, we were at the trailhead. I parked, clipped Reggie's leash, and pointed up the path. "Ready to see something new?" He sniffed the air and took the lead. The hike was slow. We stopped often. Not because Reggie was tired, he seemed to thrive on the fresh air, but because I was. My knees weren't what they used to be. But we made it. The cabin was still there, hidden behind overgrowth, the wood faded to gray. The door creaked the same way it always had. Inside, dust blanketed everything, but the structure held. Reggie explored every inch. He sniffed under the old table, circled the fireplace, then lay down in the exact spot where Rusty had in that photo. I lit a small fire, made some soup, and settled into the creaky armchair by the window. Reggie lay with his head on my foot, just like he did at home. That night, the stars came out in clusters, unbothered by city light. I stepped onto the porch with Reggie and looked up. "You've come a long way," I said. He didn't move, just leaned against my leg. In the morning, we walked down to the creek that ran behind the cabin. Reggie stepped into the water like he'd been doing it his whole life. He lapped at the current, then pounced at a floating leaf like a puppy. I hadn't seen him move like that before, not once. "You've still got it," I called. He barked. A short, surprised sound. And then another. I laughed until my sides hurt. We stayed another night, just us. The fire, the woods. And when we came down the mountain, something had shifted again. Not in a dramatic way, just like a page turning. A new chapter starting. Back home, I hung the photo of Rusty in the cabin next to the drawing of Reggie by Caleb. Different dogs. Different years. Same feeling. That week, at Maple Pines, George was waiting for us with a new chair cushion. "Thought he might like it," he said, holding it out like an offering. Reggie took his place beside him. At the library, Caleb read 2 full books without stumbling. "He's my lucky charm," he said. Reggie wagged, once. Friday, Hal at the Veteran Center told me Reggie should have his own nameplate. "He's not just a dog anymore," he said. "He's a regular." So we made one. A little wood plaque. It read, "Reggie, the listener." We hung it above the chair he always claimed. I found myself looking at that plaque a lot, wondering what it meant to really listen, to sit quietly in someone else's space and offer nothing but presence. It wasn't easy. But Reggie made it look like breathing. And more people started sitting down beside him, people who didn't talk much, people who hadn't been seen in a long time. And there Reggie sat, always steady, always there, waiting. By the time July rolled in with its thick air and slow afternoons, Reggie had made himself a fixture in the neighborhood. I couldn't walk him down Maple Street without someone stopping us, either to pet him, thank him, or ask if he remembered their kid from the library. He'd look at them the same way every time, with that quiet stillness and one tilted ear, as if to say, "I don't forget the important things." That week, I added a small sign to our porch railing, "Reggie's Rest Stop." It wasn't much, just a wooden plaque I carved with my pocket knife, hung it with twine beside a tin bucket of dog treats and a second bucket of bottled water. I wasn't expecting much from it, but it didn't take long before neighbors started stopping by with their dogs. Reggie would sit at the top of the steps, watching the newcomers like a kindly old innkeeper. One morning, a woman in a sun hat came by with a shaggy terrier named Milo. She sat on the bottom step while Milo circled the yard. Reggie stayed on the porch, head resting on his paws, eyes barely open. I think he knows who's here for more than water, she said. I nodded. He usually does. She exhaled slowly. My husband passed last month. Milo hasn't left my side since. But he's restless. I thought maybe a new place, a new friend. Reggie stood and walked down the steps. Not fast, not slow, just steady. He reached Milo, sniffed once, and lay down beside him. The terrier curled up, as if this had always been the plan. That's his way of saying, "You're okay," I said. She didn't answer, just wiped her cheek and smiled. Reggie had that effect on people. He gave them permission to feel, not in big, dramatic ways, just enough to take a breath they didn't know they'd been holding. The next few weeks blurred with activity. Between our visits, porch guests, and garden work, the days felt full in a way that didn't need explanation. Reggie had found his rhythm, and I just tried to keep up. One Wednesday at Maple Pines, George handed me an envelope. Inside was a printed list. Therapy Dog Bingo, it read at the top. Each square had a task. Make someone smile. Lie still for 5 minutes. Listen to a memory. Accept a treat without dropping crumbs. I laughed. Who made this? We did, George said, gesturing to a small group of residents gathered near the puzzle table. Keeps us sharp. Reggie's already got 4 in one visit. I pinned the list to our fridge at home. Every box we checked felt like its own kind of story. At the library, Caleb had a new haircut and a new book. This time, he didn't sit cross-legged or fidget with the pages. He read with clarity, only glancing at Reggie when he hit a long word. Reggie, as usual, didn't blink. Is he like a statue when I talk? Caleb asked. Nope, he's like a rock. He holds the story still so you can step inside it. Caleb grinned. I like that. I'm going to write that down. At the Veterans Center, Hal started calling Reggie the Doc. Said it with a kind of reverence. One afternoon, he pulled me aside after a long group session. You know what he does? Hal said. He lets you remember the good stuff without the bad stuff shouting over it. That's rare. Most of us don't get that kind of quiet anymore. On the drive home, I looked over at Reggie curled up on the passenger seat, his head bouncing slightly with each bump in the road. You're being talked about, you know, I said. Folks are giving you nicknames now. He gave a sleepy grunt. That Friday, we got a call from a small local radio station. Someone had recommended Reggie for a community segment. We'd love to do a story on therapy animals, the woman said, especially ones like Reggie, who have become local legends. I wasn't sure about it, but I agreed. They came by the house with a mic and a camera. Reggie stayed in his favorite spot by the window while I answered questions about his adoption, his visits, the brass tag, and the people he'd helped without even knowing it. What do you think he remembers from before? The host asked. I looked over at Reggie. I think he remembers enough. Enough to be patient. Enough to know when to stay. Enough to know what pain sounds like. Even when no one says a word. The segment aired that weekend. People I didn't even know started waving at us on our walks. A bakery in the next town over mailed us a tin of peanut butter bones with a note that said, "For the town's quietest hero." Reggie sniffed them once, took one delicately, and carried it to his bed like it was treasure. One evening, I got a call from the shelter where I'd found him. The director's voice was warm. We've had 3 senior dogs adopted this month, all because of Reggie. That's good to hear. There's one left. His name's Jasper, 11 years old. Bit of an attitude. We'll come meet him. Saturday morning, Reggie and I drove out to the shelter. The place looked different now, or maybe I did. Kennel 19 was empty. Clean. A small plaque on the door read, Reggie, adopted and adored. Jasper sat in kennel 7, grumpy and proud, with a crooked ear and a bark that rattled the glass. Reggie walked up, tail still, body loose. Jasper barked. Reggie just sat down. Eventually, Jasper sat too. The shelter staff watched, wide-eyed. "I've never seen him sit for anyone," one said. I filled out the paperwork. Jasper wasn't mine, but I knew someone who needed him. A retired mechanic named Tom, who'd just moved into an assisted living unit and missed the sound of claws on tile. When Tom met Jasper the next day, Reggie was there. The two dogs sniffed, circled, and then sat side by side, their eyes facing the same window. "I think they'll get along," Tom said. "They already do," I said. Reggie's work kept growing, and yet at home, he never changed. He still slept in Rusty's old bed, still sat at my feet during coffee, still stared out the window at nothing, ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. One afternoon, I opened a fresh journal and started writing. Not big stories, just pieces, quotes, moments, a kind of Reggie log. Page 1. Reggie sat beside a crying boy today and didn't move until the tears stopped. No one asked him to. Page 4. George at Maple Pines made Reggie a birthday card. Reggie sniffed it 3 times, then lay on it like a pillow. Page 7. A woman said Reggie's silence made her brave enough to speak. By the end of July, I had a dozen entries. I didn't know what I'd do with them. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. For now, they were just reminders that something small can change the shape of a day. And Reggie, without ever trying, was changing more than days. He was changing people, including me. August came in with heat that stuck to your shirt and made the streets feel too still. Reggie took to sleeping under the porch after breakfast, where the dirt stayed cool and the breeze rolled in like it had manners. I'd bring him a bowl of water and sit on the top step with a book, pretending to read, while mostly just watching the way his ears flicked at passing bees. We were due for a check-in at the vet. Just routine. His yearly visit was part of the promise I made when I signed the adoption papers. I'd called ahead, and they cleared a quiet time slot for us. No other pets in the waiting room, no loud kids, just the way Reggie preferred it. He hopped into the truck easier than usual, his legs a little more cooperative than they'd been last week. I'd learned not to comment when he did well. He didn't like being fussed over. Just a soft, good boy under my breath. And we were off. Dr. Penfield greeted us in the hallway. She'd been his vet since the beginning and always spoke to him first. "Hey there, Reggie. You keeping your human in line?" He sat and let her rub behind his ears without protest. She guided him gently to the scale, jotted down the weight, then ushered us into the exam room with the mural of flying birds on the wall. Vitals were steady, joints a little stiff, eyes still uneven, one clear, one cloudy, but alert. Teeth holding up, thanks to the dental treats and soft kibble. "You've been taking good care of him," she said, sliding her stethoscope back into her coat pocket. "He makes it easy." She looked at him, then at me. "You know, we get a lot of dogs in here. Some healthy, some sick, some scared, some wild. But Reggie, there's something different. He's got presence." "Yeah," I said. "That's the word. Presence." "Keep doing what you're doing," she said, scribbling something on the chart. "And let us know if anything changes. Anything at all." On the drive back, Reggie leaned his head out the window for a few blocks. Rare for him. He usually didn't care for wind in his face, but today he seemed to enjoy it, just for a minute. Back home, I opened all the windows. Let the warm air roll through the house like a slow tide. Reggie lay in the hallway, right in the breeze path, and fell asleep almost instantly. That evening, I got a call from the library director. "We're starting a Saturday read aloud for kids with autism," she said. "We're calling it Story Circle. It'll be small, controlled. Thought Reggie might want to be our guest of honor." "Of course," I said. "Just tell us when." Saturday morning, I clipped his vest on and gave him a quick brush down. He didn't love being groomed, but he tolerated it for the sake of appearances. The reading room had been rearranged. Fewer chairs, lower lights, soft cushions along the floor. 5 kids, each accompanied by a parent or older sibling, were already there when we arrived. Reggie walked in, gave a single blink to the group, and chose a spot near the center of the circle. A boy named Mason, maybe 9 years old, sat down beside him without hesitation. Didn't pet him, didn't speak, just sat. Reggie didn't move. The first story began, something about a dragon who couldn't breathe fire, and by the 3rd page, Mason had leaned his head against Reggie's side. The boy's mother wiped at her face silently. She wasn't the only one. Afterward, the kids took turns reading single lines. Some stumbled, some whispered. Reggie listened to all of them. Mason never left his side. The director caught me on the way out. "Whatever this dog is," she said, "he's more than a therapy animal. He's a bridge." That word stuck with me all week. Bridge. I added it to the journal. Page 14. Today, Reggie became a bridge. Between sound and silence. Between fear and trust. Between people who thought no one saw them. At Maple Pines, George had another surprise. "You know those therapy dog bingo cards?" he asked. "We made a new version, advanced level." He handed me a laminated sheet. Tasks included: make a nurse laugh, comfort someone without being asked, become the subject of a painting. Reggie had already checked off the last one. One of the residents named Earl had spent the week painting portraits in watercolors. Reggie, seated by the window with the afternoon light casting shadows across his fur, had been his first subject. The painting wasn't perfect. Reggie's ears were too small, and the proportions a bit off. But the heart of it was there. Quiet dignity. Solid presence. Earl gave it to me in a brown paper envelope. "Frame it," he said. "Or don't. Just look at it when you forget why good things matter." I framed it, hung it above the fireplace. At the Veterans Center, Hal introduced us to a new visitor, a woman named Denise, who'd served overseas and recently moved to town. "She doesn't talk much," Hal said. Figured Reggie might help. Denise sat near the wall, arms crossed, eyes wary. Reggie didn't approach right away. He just sat nearby, gave her space. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, she stood up, walked over, and sat cross-legged on the floor beside him. She said nothing, just pressed her palm to his back, and Reggie leaned into her. On the drive home, I said, "You're getting better at this." He grunted, the kind of sound he made when he wanted dinner. That night, I hosted a small cookout, just a few neighbors. Lucas from next door brought potato salad. The couple from the yellow house brought lemon bars. Reggie wandered from chair to chair, accepting gentle pets and the occasional dropped hot dog bun. At one point, a group of kids sat in the grass, forming a circle around him. One of them asked, "What do you think he's thinking?" Another said, "Probably, you kids are loud." Reggie gave a huff and rolled over onto his side. They laughed like he'd told a joke. That went into the journal to page 17. Today, Reggie made a group of kids feel like they were part of something, No directions, no instructions, just a well-timed sigh. Later that week, the mail arrived with a manila envelope. Inside was a certificate from the Therapy Dog Association. Reggie's photo in the corner, a shiny seal, and the words, "Officially Certified Therapy Dog." He didn't care. I showed it to him, and he blinked twice before going back to sleep. But I cared. Not for the paper itself, but for what it meant. That someone out there saw what I'd seen since day one, that presence could be louder than words. We put the certificate on the wall beside the painting. Now we had a corner, the Reggie wall, and it was growing. October slipped in on a breeze that carried leaves and the smell of distant wood smoke. Reggie had developed a new habit of sitting by the back door in the late afternoons, not whining or scratching, just sitting with the kind of patience only older dogs seem to master. When I opened the door, he'd walk to the edge of the yard, lie down, and watch the trees as they moved from green to gold. I started keeping a blanket on the porch bench. Not for me, though I used it sometimes, but because Reggie liked to press his back against it after sundown, when the wood turned cold. From there, we watched the world dim, one house light at a time. At the Veterans Center, Hal introduced a new group of visitors, college students from a nearby campus doing community service hours. Most of them didn't know what to expect. Therapy dogs were a concept they'd seen on social media, not something they'd experienced firsthand. Reggie sat near the far wall when they entered. Some of the students sat down across from him, uncertain. A girl named Lee reached into her pocket and pulled out a Polaroid photo. She didn't show it to anyone, just stared at it. "He looked like this," she said after a minute, holding the picture out to Reggie. "Not you exactly, different ears, but the same everything else." Reggie walked over, sat, and touched his nose to the photo. Lee let out a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for a year. Later, Hal told me she hadn't talked much in her group until today. "Reggie doesn't talk either," I said, "but he knows how to say what needs saying." That evening, back at the house, I added a new entry to the journal. Page 42. Today, Reggie reminded someone they were allowed to remember without breaking. That's not small work. The library's story circle added a second session. Word had spread, and now there were waiting lists. Some families drove in from neighboring towns. One boy named Aaron traveled an hour every week just to read his favorite dinosaur book to Reggie. "He won't read to me," his mom said with a soft laugh. "Won't even read to his sister. But this dog? He gets 3 chapters." Reggie took it all in without blinking. Aaron would lie on his stomach, book open, his voice rising and falling with excitement. Reggie's head would rest on Aaron's foot, or paw at the pages when the boy stopped too long. The library staff printed a photo of the two of them and pinned it to their board. Below it, a handwritten caption in a child's handwriting. "My best reading buddy." That weekend, Reggie and I took a short trip to a nearby lake. A family friend had a cabin there, mostly unused this time of year. I packed a cooler, a sleeping bag, and Reggie's favorite blanket, the one that smelled like the porch and everything familiar. The lake was still. Leaves floated on its surface like painted coins. Reggie stood at the edge for a long while, sniffing the air. Then he walked slowly to a cluster of pine needles and lay down. I fished a little, read a little, cooked a simple meal on a small fire pit. Reggie didn't move much, but his ears turned with every squirrel, every branch creak. That night, we sat side by side under a sky filled with stars. He leaned into me, not heavily, just enough to say he knew where he was, and that it mattered. In the cabin's guest book, I wrote a single line. Stayed here with Reggie. The stars felt less empty. Back in town, the elementary school counselor asked if Reggie might visit more often. They were starting a morning check-in program for kids who had trouble transitioning into the school day. Reggie could sit in the calm corner and just be there. I adjusted my schedule. Now every Tuesday and Thursday at 7:30 a.m., we walked through the front doors of the school, Reggie's paws making almost no sound on the linoleum. Kids came and went, some stopping to pet him, others sitting nearby without saying anything at all. A boy named Joel came in crying one morning, arms crossed tight, jaw clenched. Reggie didn't approach. He just lay nearby, his body angled so Joel didn't feel boxed in. 5 minutes passed. Then Joel scooted closer, closer still. Finally, his hand landed gently on Reggie's back. The counselor later told me Joel hadn't let anyone touch him in 3 months. I added that to the journal. Page 48. The Reggie wall at home had grown. There were now 2 shelves. One held items from Maple Pines, more paw-painted pumpkins, a little crocheted blanket someone had made just for him, and a poem written by a resident who rarely spoke. The other shelf was filled with school treasures, drawings, laminated bookmarks, and a small, crumpled origami dog labeled, "To Reggie, you make mornings better." I found myself standing in front of it more often now, not to admire, but to remember. Every item a little echo of what this one dog had built with his silence and patience. At the library, Caleb had begun volunteering to help younger kids in the story circle. He told me it was Reggie's idea. He listens to me, so now I can listen to them. That night, I looked at Reggie and said, "You're creating echoes, you know that?" He huffed and curled into his blanket. Mid-October brought a call from a woman named Donna, who ran a grief support group. They met at a community center twice a month, and someone had told her about Reggie. "We don't want him to do anything special," she said. "Just be there." We went that Thursday. The room was dim and warm, filled with the quiet murmur of chairs being adjusted and tissues passed. Reggie took a spot near the corner and lay down. No one rushed to him, but by the end of the hour, 3 people had sat near him. One rested a hand on his back without saying a word. Another just wept, shoulders shaking, while Reggie stayed still. Afterward, Donna touched my arm. "You don't always need a hug to feel held," she said. "Reggie proves that." I wrote it down. Page 53. At home, Reggie seemed more reflective lately. Not tired, just stiller. He watched things longer, spent more time at the window in the hallway, the one that faced the neighbor's oak tree. I once caught him staring at a squirrel for a full 5 minutes without moving. "You making peace with the wildlife now?" I asked. His ear flicked, but he didn't look away. Halloween approached. I never dressed Reggie up. He wouldn't have tolerated a costume. But the neighborhood kids begged to at least include him in the parade. So I tied an orange ribbon around his collar and let him sit on the porch while kids in capes and paper masks took turns saying hello. A boy in a pirate costume offered him a plastic gold coin. Reggie accepted it like it was the greatest treasure he'd ever seen. He carried it to his bed and dropped it there, then returned to the porch as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I found the coin in his food bowl. He was sharing it. Page 57. Reggie received a gift and gave it back in the way he knew best, by making it part of someone else's comfort. The last week of October brought the first frost. I started laying rugs by the doors to keep the cold from creeping in. Reggie found the thickest one and made it his new nap spot. One evening, as I was sipping tea and watching him sleep, a thought passed through me like wind under a door. All this, every visit, every smile, every quiet moment, it all came from one decision: to look closer, to read a brass tag. That tag still hung on his collar, worn, but not forgotten. If you're reading this, I was loved once, and every day, in every place we went, he was proving he still was, loved, seen, needed, and still working. November crept in quietly, the way only late autumn can, with bare branches and skies the color of old denim. The mornings came slower, the sun taking its time to rise over the roofs and trees. Reggie seemed to mirror the season. He moved with intention, not urgency. He slept a little longer, stretched a little slower, but his eyes were always alert, always watching. I kept our routines the same. Therapy visits still happened. Maple Pines on Wednesdays, the school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the library on Saturdays. But we didn't linger afterward the way we used to. Reggie did his work, calm and steady, and when it was done, he'd stand by the door, ready to go home. I didn't question it. One morning, as I sipped coffee on the porch, Reggie sat beside me and rested his chin on my knee. His breath was warm, steady. I reached down and scratched behind his ears, the way I had hundreds of times before. "You tired?" I asked. His tail thumped once. We sat like that for a long time. The leaves rustled, the wind rolled past, and I thought about all the places we'd been, all the hands that had rested on his head, all the people who'd sat beside him, needing nothing more than his presence. The journal was nearly full. 60 pages now, every one of them holding something sacred. A memory. A line someone spoke. A moment that felt too important to trust to time alone. Page 60. Reggie's not just a dog. He's a place people go when they don't know where else to turn. The school counselor called that week. "Joel asked if Reggie's coming back after the holidays," she said. "He wants to make him a Christmas card." "He'll be there," I said. That same day, I received a letter in the mail from the local Humane Society. They were honoring Reggie with a community service recognition. It was mostly symbolic, a certificate, a small ceremony, but they invited us to attend. I RSVP'd, yes. The event was held in the town hall, a small affair with a table of cookies and cider and folding chairs set up in neat rows. Reggie sat beside me as the director spoke about the impact therapy animals had on the community. She mentioned Reggie by name, twice, then handed me the certificate. It read, "For offering quiet companionship, healing presence, and hope to those who needed it most." Reggie didn't blink as applause filled the room. But when a little girl came up afterward and hugged his neck, he leaned into her like he'd been waiting all day for that one moment. On the drive home, the clouds gathered. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the first snowflakes of the season had started to fall. They landed on Reggie's fur like stars, soft and cold, but he didn't shake them off. Just stood there a moment, nose tilted up, taking it in. That night, I lit the fireplace and pulled his blanket closer to the hearth. He curled up on it without being asked. I sat nearby, reading, glancing up now and then to see him sleeping soundly, ears twitching with dreams. A few days later, we visited Maple Pines. George was waiting by the window with 2 mugs of cider, one for me, one empty, just a habit now. "He looks older," George said gently. "He is older." Reggie walked over, nudged George's hand, and lay down beside his chair. He's still got it, though, George said, patting his head. Still doing the work. We stayed longer that day. Something told me we should. That weekend, Reggie didn't come to the library. I let the staff know ahead of time. He wasn't sick. Not exactly. Just slow. Still eating, still walking, but quieter. I made him scrambled eggs Sunday morning and fed him by hand. He licked my fingers gently, then lay his head in my lap. I read aloud from the journal. He stayed still, eyes closed, tail thumping every few pages. That night, he chose to sleep at the foot of my bed. He hadn't done that in weeks. I left the window cracked open so he could hear the wind. Monday morning, I woke before sunrise. Reggie was still there, still warm, but he didn't lift his head. I sat beside him, placed my hand on his chest, still breathing. Slower now. "I'm right here," I whispered. He opened one eye, then the other. I stayed with him. Didn't move, didn't speak again. The sun came up slowly, casting pale light across the floor. Reggie let out a long breath, then another, and then stillness. No sound, no twitch, just still. I didn't cry right away, just sat there, hand on his side, letting the moment happen. Eventually, I stood up and wrapped him in his blanket, the one from the porch, the one that smelled like home. I buried him in the backyard, beneath the maple tree where he liked to sit in the afternoons. I placed the brass tag at the base of the stone marker, the one that read, "If you're reading this, I was loved once." I added a new line beneath it, "and loved again." That afternoon, I sat on the porch, alone, but not empty. The wind moved through the trees the same way it always had, and I could almost hear the soft click of his paws on the steps. In the weeks that followed, I still visited the school, the library, Maple Pines, not every day, but some. People asked about Reggie. Some cried, some smiled. I brought the journal with me. Let them read their own moments, their own stories, their own memories of a dog who never said a word but somehow told everyone what they needed to hear. One day, I received a letter from a young woman who used to sit with Reggie at the library. "I'm studying to be a therapist," she wrote, "because of a dog who never asked me to be anything but myself." Another note came from a teacher at the elementary school. "Joel still visits the calm corner. He brings a stuffed dog with him, says it helps his heart stop shouting." And one day, a little boy approached me at the grocery store. "You were with the quiet dog," he said. I was. He made me feel like I was already okay. I knelt down and smiled. He made me feel that way too. That night, I sat at the Reggie wall. I lit a candle and placed a new item on the shelf, a small wooden figure of a dog carved by George, donated after he passed. And then I opened a fresh journal. On page 1, I wrote, "Reggie didn't just change lives. He connected them, and in doing so, reminded us that the quietest presence can be the loudest kind of love." The wind rustled outside, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard the softest wag of a tail.